Welcome, everyone. I'm Dick Deming. I'm Medical Director of Mercy One Cancer Center and the founder of Above and Beyond Cancer. Welcome to our weekly cancer education series. It's brought to you in part by a grant from the Iowa Oncology Society. Our topic tonight is the biology of hope, and our guest is my friend, Dr. Susan Lutgendorf, professor of psychology at the University of Iowa. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here with you.
It is great to have you here, and I am really excited about the topic that we're going to talk about. But before we get to the topic, let's get to know you a little bit. I gave you just a very, very brief introduction, but I love to share with people kind of how people got from A to B to C to maybe you're all the way up to W by now in your career. Where were you born, and where did you spend your high school years?
I'm from the East Coast. I grew up in New Jersey and I went to high school in New Jersey, central New Jersey.
And is central New Jersey, is it the part of New Jersey that's like New York City, or is it the part of Jersey that is the Garden State?
Well, I would say neither, even though my mother tried very hard to have a couple of corn plants and a couple of tomato plants in the backyard. Um, we were we were on a train line that went into New York City, about 45 minutes away from New York City. So when I was a little kid, we still had woods around, woods and creeks and places you could, you know, um, uh, be into nature immediately. And by the time I left, everything was built up with houses and shopping centers and that kind of thing. But we were very close to Rutgers. We were about 20
Oh,
minutes away from
okay.
Rutgers. And so it was very easy to go there and use the library. That was in the days before you could do everything online. You had to go there
Right.
in person to
And
find out.
how big of a high school? How many were in your graduating class?
Um, I don't know, probably less than 500.
Okay, but still big
Yeah.
compared to a small high school in South Dakota.
Yes. Yes.
And so here's my favorite question. What was your claim to fame in high school?
I was valedictorian.
All
I
right.
was on the tennis team. The I was one of the newspaper editors. I was in the chorus. So
I
um,
love it. I love it.
all those things.
Great. And then where did you go once you graduated from high school?
So I first went to, for my first 2 years, I went to University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia as an undergraduate. Um, and then I transferred to the University of Chicago.
And when you started college, that first semester, what was your very first declared major when you started college?
Um, I was a psychology major, and
Okay. From
I
the
was
very beginning.
interested in what's now called neuroscience. At that time, it was called physiological psychology, and I was doing various experiments with rat brains and things like that. Um, and and but I was also exposed to a lot of anthropology, a lot of Eastern religion, many things I never thought I would be exposed to. So
So
it's
were you like the classic rats in a maze sort of thing?
um, well, it was an interesting thing because I was doing I was doing rats in a maze. I was looking at brains of rats, that kind of thing. But it turned out that I was really more interested in humans and in human psychology, the human search for meaning, the um, things like therapy, psychopathology. So so that whole that whole aspect of psychology ended up appealing to me a lot more.
And then the transition from undergrad to graduate school, did you go directly from undergraduate school to graduate school, or did you go into the workforce?
Well, so this is sort of funny to admit now, when I finished my undergraduate studies, I I was so burnt out, I didn't want to read a nonfiction anything again. And so so I got a job at a mental hospital for 3 years. And that was really, really interesting. So I wasn't ready to go to graduate school. I was really interested in issues related to mental health, psychotherapy, all that. But um, I, um, I I it was too much to think about going for a PhD, although many of my friends were. And but I thought, I mean, I feel like I got a really good education in mental health working in the mental hospital, because it was a state of Illinois mental hospital. So this is where people would come who were walking naked down the Eisenhower Expressway and things like that. And it was a very good education in psychopathology. And it
Mm.
was something that I used later on when I've taught intro clinical psychology. I get all my best examples, you know,
Yeah.
from back
So
then.
then after working there for several years, you came back into education and got your PhD. What did you
Well,
study?
there was a long circuit. So after I got my, I'll give you a few of the gory details. So after I worked for 3 years at a mental hospital, then I went back and got a degree in social work because I wanted a quick way to do psychotherapy. And so I got a degree in social work. At that point, my husband got a job at the University of Iowa, and we moved to Iowa. And so I worked for 4 years as a psychotherapist. And at that point, after I was doing that, I had many people who came to me who had issues that were somehow connecting mind and body. And I started being very interested in trying to understand what's the scientific connection between mind and body, between stress and how various bodily systems work. And so it was only after that amount of life experience that I went to graduate school, and I went to graduate school at the University of Miami. And they were one of the few places in the country that was studying psychoneuroimmunology, which is a study of how the brain affects the neuroendocrine stress systems and the immune system. And we were studying both HIV and cancer at that point. And we were looking at how stress or stress management affected, and this was before antivirals, so for HIV. So we were looking at how stress affected the immune system, how stress reduction could affect the immune system and viral load in HIV, and then we moved the same principles onto cancer. Um, and and so when I finished graduate school, I came back to the University of Iowa because my husband was at the University of Iowa all that time. Oh, and I missed a few. I have a few lost years in there. 3 years when my husband was studying in India, and so the whole family lived in India at that point, in various places in India. Um, but so I came back to Iowa, and that's when I was approached by somebody in gynecologic oncology who was really interested in doing research, and that's really how I started working in gynecologic oncology. So that's
And
long
right.
circles, sort of.
Yeah, and so you actually started working your first exposure to working with cancer patients sounds like was in your graduate program at Miami, and then you had
Yeah,
the opportunity when you came onto the faculty at the University of Iowa to also continue that exploration of, mind-body connection, especially as it relates to cancer patients.
yeah, yeah. And I actually did a postdoc in aging at the University of Iowa. And one of the things that I'm interested in now, although I'm not actively studying it, is there's an emerging literature on the role of cancer and cancer treatments in accelerated aging in patients, and which is a whole nother topic which I can't really say much about, but it's just, suddenly there's an intersection of various interests.
Okay. Well, let's get on to our topic for tonight, which is really fascinating to me. So we're calling it the biology of hope, but I think we probably need thinking about something is some definitions. So we probably better focus on the word hope to begin with. And as a psychologist, how would you define hope and maybe compare and contrast it to hopelessness or to other words that you think are useful in describing what the concept of hope means?
Well, so I can give you one take of it on this. This has been a topic of interest of many people, a topic of controversy, and there are psychologists who have given a variety of different definitions to hope. Um, One of the key definitions is one that has been given by a psychologist named Dr. Snyder, who talks about hope as something involving several different components. One has to do with goals. So you have goals that have meaning in them. A second component is the perception of the ability to find ways to reach those goals. And the third thing is a motivation to reach those goals. And this is really different than optimism, because optimism is something, it's much more of a trait variable that has, like, in many circumstances, you anticipate the sunny side. You anticipate that things will go well. Hope is sometimes something that really requires courage of doing something, surmounting obstacles or knowing that there are obstacles, and doing your best to greet those obstacles.
Gotcha. So it almost seems like optimism is more like a personality trait, and the way you're defining hope is a strategy of living your life or a strategy of improving your life.
Well, it's a strategy and it's something that has meaning.
Mhm.
Um, and and it's a, hope, being thinking of hope that way is a little bit different than saying, I mean, we use hope all the time. You can use hope in every sense. I mean, I hope that miraculously dinner will appear on the table when I get home tonight. That's hoping, but that's, I
Or
mean,
you
it's
could actually just hope your husband made dinner.
well, he probably will, as a matter of fact. He's a great cook.
Yes.
But but in the sense that we think of hope with relation to disease, the kind of model that I just talked about is important. And I think one of the things that's important to think about with it, hope in the context of cancer doesn't mean cure. It means, it often means finding a meaningful path forward given whatever circumstances you have. And that's not just with cancer. I mean, that's really with life. That's the same thing with aging, where different body parts break down. What's your best way forward? How do you reach meaningful goals given the constraints you have?
Right, right. And we obviously think of it in cancer because it's such a powerful concept. It's like, how can you be faced with such a dire situation and still move forward with, hope and optimism perhaps, but it's a strategy that, it has a positive context to it.
Yeah.
So, as opposed to hopelessness, I mean, that word even sounds just like there's no way forward, and it's black and dark and frowny face. And hope, isn't necessarily joyful, but it is a positive, not just being passive, but a positive strategy forward.
Well, when I think of hopelessness, I think of the Dementors in Harry Potter, who, if you've read Harry Potter, were these creatures that kind of sucked the souls out of people, and they collapsed, in a sense, and didn't. Are you a Harry Potter reader, or?
I am not. I am.
Oh,
I'm sort of following you along, but
okay,
this is an education for me in Harry Potter. A
okay.
Dementor,
But
is
but
that?
Dementor, yeah. But if you want to um, flip sides, um, I knew someone who had an incurable case of cancer, one of my friends. But while she could do it, she went and visited her children as much as she could out of state, visited her grandchildren. She walked across England, as she set up these goals of how she was going to find satisfaction in
Mhm.
her life. And when she stopped being able to be that energetic, she found her hope in making her garden grow. So some of it is what can give your life meaning that you can engage in.
Right. It doesn't necessarily have to be specifically about finding a treatment or cure for the cancer. It's about a life with meaning.
Right,
So my
right.
next
And
question would be, go ahead, go ahead.
oh well, what I was going to say is, so I collaborate with a an oncologist, as who Ben Korn, um, who studies hope. And one of the things he has said is all human beings, by virtue of being a human being, crave hope. There's something built in that we want meaning. We want this way to go forward.
Right, and I
I
hope
hope
that
that
ambulance is not coming for you.
No, we're
Um,
not far from the hospital, though.
yeah, so obviously in psychology, you need to assess, I mean, if you're gonna study hope, assess whether someone has hope or doesn't have hope. Are there validated surveys, questionnaires that allow you to discern whether one person is hopeful as opposed to hopeless, or how would you determine?
Well, it would be nice to have litmus paper, wouldn't it?
Yes, right.
Just put it on the tongue. But yeah, there are validated surveys that look at, um, whether distinguish whether somebody is hopeful or hopeless. And um, in the work that we've done, we we added on the idea. We got interested in the idea of hope afterwards, and so we weren't using a validated survey. We were using what they call some face valid items of I have hope, to and like zero from not at all to extremely, or X amount of days a week, or I'm losing hope in the face of my illness from zero to um, from not at all to extremely sort of things.
And then we titled this talk "The Biology of Hope." So we touched a little bit on philosophy and maybe psychology. Tell us, how do you study the biology of hope?
So we've been looking at a variety of things related to the biology of cancer, and much of our work has been in ovarian cancer. One of the things that we have looked at is the level of inflammation, and we've looked at some molecules. One of them is called interleukin 6 or IL-6, which is a, a a key inflammatory molecule, and we use it kind of like a biomarker, like a signal molecule. And we found that we didn't do this over time. We were just looking at ovarian cancer patients before they were even um, before they had their surgery, so before treatment. Um, so there were no confounds in terms of just having had surgery or having chemotherapy in the blood or anything like that. And so with an inflammatory cytokine, they can support tumor growth because inflammation can support tumor growth. And this particular cytokine, IL-6, has been higher levels in blood and in the fluid, in the peritoneal fluid, has been shown to be related to shorter survival in ovarian cancer. And so one of the things that we found was that hope, even when you're controlling for biological variables like age and stage and depression and things like that, hope was related to lower levels of this important inflammatory cytokine. So another thing that we looked at was the stress hormone cortisol. And one of the things about this hormone cortisol is that it has a specific cycle during the day. It rises in the morning and then it goes down and it's low all night and then it starts to rise in the morning. And in addition to being a stress hormone, cortisol is related to every cell in the body. And the rise in cortisol is one of the things that kicks us out of bed in the morning. It's like, all right, let's get some action here because it's related to metabolism. And so one of the things that's been seen in ovarian cancer, as well as breast cancer, lung cancer, renal cancer, and a few other cancers, is that somehow as cancer progresses, people's diurnal cortisol, instead of being high in the morning and low at night, kind of flattens out a little bit. And the reason for that isn't really well understood, whether it has to do with inflammation or whether it has to do with the tumor itself. And that flat slope has been related to poorer survival in a number of cancers. So one of the things that we found is that hope was related to a healthier cortisol slope, a steeper slope. And this is just before surgery. Okay. And so what that's saying is that in a way there's like some kind of signature of hope in the body that you can detect that people who have higher hope, and because it's cross sectional, it's not, we can't say it causes this, but there's this very strong and positive relationship between people having hope and healthier inflammatory and stress hormone profiles. And I should say we've found similar kinds of things with social support or social isolation, that hope isn't the only thing. I mean, hope, we're having a conversation about hope, and hope is great, and but there are many other psychological factors that really seem to have an impact or a strong relationship with tumor biology. And one of the strongest ones we've seen is social support versus isolation. So, and I want to pop back to hope for a minute, because you may have people answering or who are listening who are thinking, all right, I got to be hopeful now. And and you can't will yourself to be hopeful, and it's not necessarily a great idea to search for a positive way to look at things and grit your teeth and say, I'm going to think positive now. But but there are ways of increasing hope, and but I would put it with increasing many aspects of people's positive ways of looking at things. And some of that has to do, or some ways people have talked about doing that are finding out what you value, figuring out what's meaningful to you, and how you can incorporate that in your life, feeling gratitude, feeling being mindful is another way of doing that. Um, and but it's not like denying your other emotions, because we all get angry, we all get disappointed, we all feel in one way or another. I won't say we all do, but many of us, when you hit a certain age, you start realizing that your body is betraying you in whatever way it decides to do that. And you can be angry about that. And but but there's a way of having that and then not sinking into the anger, but working with it and saying, yeah, that's true. It's not what I wanted. How can I go forward now?
Okay. So a couple of questions.
I
So
just rambled on. So,
that was so a couple of questions I would have. I mean, it's related to the study that you saw that there was a relationship, people who were hopeful and their IL-6
mhm,
level and also the slope of um, their
cortisol.
cortisol. So, um, let's take that as a given. You mentioned ways in which people could maybe cultivate hope, and I would say that the ways you mentioned could be a positive end result on their own, whether or not it has an effect on the cancer. But
Yeah, well,
since we're talking
exactly.
about hope and cancer, if there is a relationship between IL-6 and hope, and there's a relationship between the slope of cortisol throughout the day and hope, do we know whether those things really do impact the outcome of that particular patient's cancer journey? Or is it just having hope gives you a better outlook on life that provides you more joy in life, regardless of whether you live a day longer?
So there was a study that came out in 2022 looking at patients in palliative care, advanced stage cancer patients. And one of the things they found was an association between patients who had a higher level of hope and lower mortality among these palliative care cases. And lower mortality probably means, they had a longer lifespan in
Mm,
palliative care. Um, that's the only study that I know of that's looked at cancer progression with hope. Um, More often you've seen it, like, so there was a large scale study a meta-analysis combining studies together, and they used something like 33 studies, and they found that hope was related to better quality of life and better social relationships and a better sense of spiritual and existential well-being and less depression, less distress, and less concern about symptomatology. So those kind of things, which would be more quality of life um, uh, characteristics, seem to be things that are more related to hope.
Yeah. So I like all of that. And I think the question is, what can we do to help instill or cultivate or whatever the right verb is to get more hope into people? So let me just say that in what I'm doing now with integrative oncology, I see individuals that get involved in our art therapy, for example. I see the what I would call hope, obviously, or perhaps not obviously, but I didn't do a validated survey of hope. But it would seem like getting involved in some of these creative endeavors that have to do with meaning and purpose and sort of finding a perspective of their life with cancer, that those endeavors that involve creativity tend to bring out what looks like
Mm-hmm.
hope in people.
Mm-hmm. I think so. Um, and actually, the oncologist I mentioned to you before, Ben Korn, has developed something called the Institute for the Study of Hope, Dignity, and Well-being. He's based in Israel, but he has collaborators all through the U.S. And they have workshops for people to build hope, like to enhance hope. And there, he has worked with cancer patients, but he's also worked with first responders and doctors and nurses and healthcare teams. And he feels very strongly from this experience that hope is teachable, or hope skills are teachable. Um,
Mhm. And as you
and
mentioned that, I think also sometimes journaling or writing, whether it's poetry or, narrative, creative nonfiction. Are there other activities that you know from his research that might specifically be activities that instill hope in individuals?
I'm not that familiar with what his intervention looks like, but certainly the kind of thing that you were talking about, like art therapy or it's like finding ways to get beyond yourself. And, and certainly, community and fellowship is one of the things that nurtures that kind of thing. And for example, what you're doing in Above and Beyond, you know, maybe somebody isn't going to be like they were in their former self, but they can have a goal, and a goal that's
Mhm.
important with a community. So I think that's almost like a prototype of,
Right. Climbing a mountain is a very tangible goal,
yeah,
and I had never really connected having a goal that you're working toward as part of the definition of hope. I like that
yeah,
as much better than just this, innate personality of sunniness.
yeah,
Um
yeah.
Um, the research that you're doing on the biology of hope, are you still collecting data? Are you in the process of writing the paper? Where are you, and maybe teach us a little bit about how does an experiment like this come to fruition?
So we published a paper on this a couple of years ago, and right now we're doing a secondary analysis of data and looking to see if if there are attributes in within tumors themselves that differ between people who are high versus low in hope, and that's just very much in process.
Okay. And when you are working with ovarian cancer patients, are you engaged with the actual caregivers, whether it's the oncologists or the nurses or um, the counselors in the cancer center? How do you recruit patients? And when you start on this path with hope, does that get the docs taking care of the patients excited about your work?
Well, so we've just been doing for the last 5 years a clinical trial that's was funded by the National Cancer Institute. Um, that was an in a you could call it a psychological, a lifestyle, a well-being um, intervention that I think probably ended up with people being more hopeful, although we haven't looked at that specifically. But we were running groups for ovarian cancer patients, live groups that taught things like um, coping, um, prioritizing, how to find social support, communication, plus things like mindfulness, relaxation, gratitude. So a whole a whole bunch of skills, and then so we were doing this a live group by Zoom, and we recruited patients both online and from cancer centers in Seattle, Iowa, Nebraska, Miami, Anchorage, and we had patients really from Alaska to the Caribbean, and these were all people who participated. The other group that we did, so we had um, this intervention group called Living Well, and we had a comparison group, which was a lifestyle group where we had lectures on sleep and exercise and nutrition, and so basically whichever arm of the study you got something. But so we were getting lots of recruitment from clinics as well as online, and people from various cancer organizations were sending us their people as well.
Right. I recruited patients for that as well. Do you have enough like blood samples to go back now, and now that you know from the study that people who have hope have a lower level of IL-6, to now do with the control group and the group that you might have instilled hope in through this support group and education, to validate whether your living well intervention actually instilled hope or at least reduced IL-6?
So what we did in this intervention that we just did, so when you're doing, if you're just doing something at the University of Iowa, people come into clinic and they're giving a blood sample anyway, and you can take an extra tube. With people who are spread out all over the country, we use something called blood spots, which is like a little card, like a little index card. And we would send the card out to people with a little lance, and they would put a drop of blood in four little spots on this card. Um, and so we have blood spots from the people who were in this clinical trial, pre and post, and that data is currently being analyzed, but we don't have that yet.
And there must be some limitations in how much testing you can do on a blood spot, or is it amazing how what sort
Well,
of
well, so you can't get exactly what you would get in plasma. So we were doing analyses of RNA to look at gene expression in in these blood spots, but you're only getting peripheral blood. You can't get peritoneal fluid from a blood spot, and you can't get cortisol from a blood spot. So, what you get is really much more like what genes are turned on, what genes are turned off, which is really useful information.
Hmm.
Um, so that's something to look out for in the future when we get that data back and write it up.
Okay. Well, are you open for some questions right now?
Sure.
Good. So we have a live studio audience here, and they're going to get first shot. If you are watching us live streaming right now, please put your question into the comments section. And any questions, fair game. So we're talking about hope, but if you have a question that has to do with the intersection of psychology and cancer, those are all fair game as well.
And I'm really sorry I can't see the audience.
Yeah, I am too, because they are beautiful people.
I'm
And some
sure.
of them are dressed ready for a spin class that's going to happen after this. George, you get the first question.
Yeah, the question that I have, many of the sciences are under stress right now. It'd be probably too much to say that it's under attack, maybe not. But what about the science of psychology in particular? It seems like it's always been a target. And do you get any of that sensibility out there at the University of Iowa?
Um, I think many sciences are under attack, and I don't know that psychology is under particular attack. Um, and, I think one of the hardest things right now is because there's so much information going back and forth about what's true and what's not true, and we've grown up in a situation where you collect data, you do an experiment over and over and over again, you make sure your findings are robust, and then you let people know about it. And all I can say is that it's really important to find ways to get that respected.
And have you had any um, freezing of funding that resulted in the need to stop researching or lay off any research staff?
That has happened. And, I don't really know the extent to which it's happened. I know it's much, much harder to get grants right now. And funding lines are really low. Like at one time, I heard that one of the funding lines at the National Cancer Institute was something like 4 or 5%, which means that 95% of grants that people are writing are not funded. And some of those have really good ideas. And I mean, the issue is really just backfiring against the progress of medical science.
Yeah. And I'd heard that the committees that, make the decisions, they just weren't meeting. They weren't even allowed to meet. So it kind of slows down that whole.
They're meeting again, but many of them were scheduled to meet during the time of the shutdown in October. And people expected to be funded in March. And so all those meetings have been moved up 3 months. And so, that really affects when somebody has a grant and, they have to pay, they have people, their research assistant, their coordinator, their nurse, all these people on grants. And you have this lapse of several months before you know if you're going to be funded or not. That affects, real life people and salaries and whatnot.
We have a question about social isolation. So
Okay.
you mentioned, I think it was perhaps a correlation between hope and social connection. And I guess the question is, when you look at social determinants of health and social connection, how can your study correlate or distinguish between how important is social connection to being hopeful?
Well, I haven't looked at them together. What I was saying before was that social connection is one of the strongest things that we've found that's related to biology. And it's probably something we'll look more closely at in the future. Are people with a high level of social connection, do they have hope or not? Or what's their level of hope? But we haven't looked at that closely.
Mm-hmm. And then there's always the chicken and the egg thing, like
Right.
are people that are, and I know we're not talking about cheerfulness and despair, but are people without hope, are they less likely to engage in social
Engage with others? Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think you're right that there's chicken and the egg.
Yeah.
And I want to point out something which I didn't say before, but I think is really important to say in a conversation like this, which is, we're talking about a psychological characteristic like hope, which hopefully is a lifestyle characteristic that can be modified. But it people should not blame themselves if they've had times when they're not feeling hopeful, or there are times that they're not feeling despairing, or where they're feeling despairing, because everybody goes through situations like that. And certainly cancer is a a challenge. The challenge is people's deepest core. And so um you know one thing, so I really want people to know to not blame yourself if
Mm-hmm.
you lose hope, or or you despair, or you get hopeless, because it's part of the human condition.
Yeah, I would even say that feeling hopeless at a certain point is the intelligent, rational approach to hearing a whole bunch of bad news on the same day. I mean, yes, you've got to digest that and move on, but it is the um, kind of the rational, intelligent response to getting a bunch of bad news. We do have a question here from a cancer survivor. Poon, you're up next.
Yes. Do you find that cancer patients, after they finish their treatment, and for example, Dr. Deming used to had a survivorship plan for his patients. Do you find that that's hopeful for patients?
So I'm going to give you sort of a theoretical answer, rather than, because I've never looked at do people do better with a survivorship plan or without a survivorship plan. I think the reason that survivorship plans were instituted is that it gave people something to follow and a way to plan. And anytime you have something that's under your control, that you have a sense of what to do, what I can do to keep myself in line, to keep moving forward. That's something that's helpful. And one of the components of hope, which is agency, you feel like there's something that you can do. A survivorship plan is really something that gives people a map, which to me is something which can solidify your sense of self-efficacy. Yes, there's something I can do. I'm not just a passive recipient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that before, but it makes perfect sense, especially going back to the beginning of our conversation, and hope being this strategy of having a goal and moving toward a goal. George.
I was interested in the part of the conversation about cortisol in particular, going all the way back to John Kennedy, who I remember had Addison's disease, and my mother died of adrenal cancer, actually, which is somewhat rare. I know cancer doctors are always interested in that. Is this stuff all related? I'm talking about the adrenal function and cortisol and that type of thing.
Well, so the cortisol is secreted by the adrenal glands, and it's secreted after there's a hormone that's secreted in the brain called ACTH, and it hits the adrenals and turns on the adrenals to secrete cortisol. And then when you have too much cortisol, it goes back to the brain and tells the brain, I don't need that much, shut it off. And that's one of the feedback mechanisms that doesn't work that well in things like Addison's disease. But I don't know how adrenal cancer affects that whole axis and that whole feedback system. Do you, Dr. Deming?
Not super well, but it's definitely you can, with adrenal cancer that is a functional tumor, yes, have excess cortisol. But I would also say that in terms of the adrenal cancer is very, very rare. And so what Dr. Lutgendorf is talking about when testing cortisol levels isn't so much the adrenal gland being affected directly by the cancer, but more the body's stress. So, somebody who has totally a normal physiology and steps out in the backyard and a dog barks, I mean, you're going to feel the effects of a cortisol release. And so it's often considered a stress hormone. So I think in the context of Dr. Lutgendorf's study, it's not so much the direct effect of cancer on the adrenal gland or adrenal cancer, but more how does having cancer in your body affect that whole, correct me if I'm wrong, but sort of the fight or flight, the stress that you're feeling, or is it something different than a stress hormone in this sense?
So what we don't know is that if there are high levels of inflammation in the body from the cancer, if that's causing the brain to say, oh, we need more cortisol here to dampen that down. And if you have too much cortisol, is the feedback system being affected? Or is it something else?
Okay.
Do people physically inherently have an ability to secrete cortisol at different levels? And if so, does that change people's demeanor? I mean, is it a big deal? It seems like it would be. I mean, all people are different. So are people, reacting to their body's cortisol secretions differently?
So what we know is that if people have a high level of chronic stress, and that could be related to cancer treatment, it could be related to a job, it could be related to going through a divorce, a financial situation, a difficulty with caregiving, or a teenager who sasses back at you. We live with all kinds of chronic situations that can elevate not only cortisol but other stress hormones. And I think one of the things that people that we work with in groups with patients is what you can do to modulate your stress levels. So we don't necessarily think about, using a cortisol monitor, but, people have physiological indicators of stress. If your stomach is tight, if your chest is tight, if your neck hurts, if your back hurts, your body, everybody's body has different kinds of ways of alerting you to, oh yeah, there's just a little bit too much stress going on. And so learning those indicators of chronic stress and thinking about what are some ways that fit for you in reducing them, for example, like spin class, is an important thing to be thinking about.
Mm-hmm. So we have come to the end of our discussion. This has been wonderful. It's been great to reconnect with you, Susan, and to have such an interesting conversation about the biology of hope. And it truly has made me think about hope in a very different way than I did before we started this conversation. So thank you. And
You're
our
welcome.
our guest tonight, again, has been Dr. Susan Lutgendorf, professor of psychology at the University of Iowa. If you are watching this program tonight and you know someone that would benefit by watching it, good news, this program will be available on demand beginning tomorrow at the Above and Beyond Cancer YouTube channel or the Mercy Cancer Center website. And I hope you'll join us again next week. Thanks, everyone.